In the year 240 before Christ, a man named Eratosthenes stood in Alexandria, measured the angle of a shadow at noon, compared it to the absence of shadow in a well at Siene, hundreds of kilometers south, and calculated the circumference of the entire earth to within roughly 2% of the true figure. He did this with a stick, a measurement of distance, and the resources of a single city. That city at that moment held perhaps 500,000 souls, making it the largest metropolis in the Mediterranean world. Its lighthouse stood over 100 meters tall, its flame visible 50 kilometers out to sea. Its library may have held 500,000 scrolls. And yet today, almost the entire ancient city lies beneath the pavement of a modern metropolis of 5 million, or submerged under the harbor waters where divers now swim over the shattered faces of colossal royal statues. How does a city that literally measured the world disappear so completely that for centuries no one could say precisely where its palaces stood? This is the question this film exists to answer. Not with fragments, not with a single famous name or a single famous fire. This is the complete biography of Alexandria, from the first day to the last stone, and everything that lived between. We begin with the land itself, a narrow limestone ridge between the Mediterranean and a brackish lake, chosen by Alexander of Macedon in 331 before Christ for reasons that were pure strategic genius. We trace the engine that made the city extraordinary, the marriage of Egyptian grain wealth to Greek intellectual ambition, a system so powerful it funded the greatest concentration of scholars the ancient world ever produced. We walk the streets at their height, the 5 lettered quarters, the great canopic way stretching 5 kilometers east to west, the markets where glass was blown and papyrus pressed and perfume bottled for export across 3 continents. We stand in the Mouseion where Euclid composed his Elements, where Herophilus performed the first systematic human dissections, where Callimachus catalogued all of Greek literature in 120 volumes. But we also follow the shadows, the ethnic riots that killed thousands, the fire that rose from the harbor warehouses during Caesar's war, the siege under Diocletian that broke the city's walls and its confidence together. We witness the moment the Serapeum fell in 391 of the Common Era, and we ask what was truly lost and what survived. We follow the philosopher Hypatia to her final year, and we trace the long, slow withdrawal, the earthquakes that sank the royal quarter beneath the waves, the harbor silting shut, the population collapsing from hundreds of thousands to mere thousands huddled inside a fraction of the ancient walls. And then we follow the rediscovery, the divers descending into blue-green Mediterranean light to map a drowned palace, the archaeologists uncovering Roman lecture halls beneath a modern neighborhood, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina rising in 2002 near the site where the ancient library once stood, a conscious echo across 23 centuries. What makes Alexandria irreplaceable is not romance, it is consequence. The geometry you learned in school passed through this city. The translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, was made here, reshaping the foundations of Christianity. The astronomical models that guided navigation for 1,000 years were refined in its observatories. When Arab scholars preserved and transmitted Greek knowledge to medieval Europe, much of what they saved had been collected, copied, and catalogued in Alexandria first. Remove this one city from the human story, and the map of knowledge has a hole so vast you cannot chart around it. The Pharos Lighthouse still appears on Egypt's coat of arms. Its light went out centuries ago. But the question that haunts every chapter of this story is not simply why the flame died. It is how it burned so brightly in the first place, and whether the very thing that made it shine contained the flaw that guaranteed its end. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the great cities of history, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each time we bring one legendary city fully back to life, from its first wall to its silent ruins, from the crowded harbor to the archaeologist's careful hand. Let us begin where every city begins, with the land itself, long before the first stone was laid, on a ridge between two waters where a young conqueror paused and saw a future no one else could see. Before there is a city, there is only the wind. It moves across a low limestone ridge that separates two bodies of water, the Mediterranean to the north, broad and salt-heavy, and Lake Mareotis to the south, shallow, brackish, threaded with channels that reach towards the canopic branch of the Nile. A small Egyptian fishing village called Rakotis clings to the western end of this ridge. Offshore, the island of Pharos breaks the open swells into something calmer, creating a natural anchorage that most of the ancient world has overlooked for centuries. In the spring of 331 before the Common Era, Alexander of Macedon arrives on this coast. He is 25 years old, already master of Greece and conqueror of the Persian garrison at Pelusium. Egypt has surrendered without a siege. According to the later tradition preserved in the pseudo-Callisthenes romance, the foundation falls on the 7th of April, though the precise date remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is the strategic logic. Alexander, or his architect Dinocrates of Rhodes, recognizes what the ridge offers. The island of Pharos, sitting roughly 1.5 kilometers from shore, can be joined to the mainland by a causeway, creating not one harbor but two, a great eastern harbor open to the prevailing winds, and a western harbor sheltered behind the link. The lake to the south connects through canals to the Nile, which means that every bushel of grain harvested in the richest river valley on earth can travel by barge to this coast without ever crossing open sea. Fresh water flows underground from the river through channels that later centuries will expand into a vast cistern network beneath the streets. The plan laid out on the ridge follows the Hippodamian grid, straight streets crossing at right angles, a rational geometry imposed on sand and rock. The Great East-West Boulevard, later called the Canopic Way, will stretch roughly 5 kilometers from the Sun Gate to the Moon Gate. A north-south artery will intersect it near the city's center. 5 quarters, eventually designated by the first 5 letters of the Greek alphabet, are sketched into the grid. The old village of Rakotis is absorbed into the southwestern district. Harbors, temples, an agora, and a royal quarter along the eastern waterfront are all part of the original vision. Alexander never sees any of it built. He departs within weeks, marching west to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, then east toward Mesopotamia and the campaigns that will carry him to the Indus. He never returns to Egypt. In June of 323 before the Common Era, he dies in Babylon at the age of 32. His body becomes the object of an extraordinary contest. Perdiccas, the regent, intends to carry the corpse to the royal tombs at Aegi in Macedonia. But Ptolemy, son of Lagos, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, now satrap of Egypt, intercepts the funeral cortege somewhere in Syria. The ancient sources disagree on the details, but the outcome is clear. Alexander's body is brought to Egypt, first to Memphis, and eventually to the city that bears his name. The hijacking of a king's corpse is not sentiment, it is statecraft. Whoever holds Alexander's body holds a claim to his legacy, and Ptolemy understands that a city without a founder's presence is merely a port. With the body installed, Alexandria becomes a shrine, a capital, and a statement of succession all at once. Workers are already cutting limestone, digging the canal from the Nile to the lake, and laying the first courses of the Heptastadion causeway that will bind Pharos to the mainland. Settlers arrive, Macedonian veterans, Greek merchants, Egyptian laborers, Jewish traders from the Levant. The population in these earliest years is modest, perhaps a few tens of thousands, but the infrastructure is scaled for something far larger. The grid does not accommodate the present, it anticipates a future. On Pharos Island, the foundations for a tower are being surveyed. Across the harbour, warehouses rise along the eastern docks. The ridge between two waters is no longer empty. Ptolemy, son of Lagos, understands something that the other successors do not. In the wars that fracture Alexander's empire after 323 before the Common Era, generals seize provinces, armies, treasuries. Ptolemy seizes a corpse. The funeral carriage, a golden temple on wheels drawn by 64 mules, bearing Alexander's embalmed body toward Macedonia, is intercepted somewhere in Syria, probably near Damascus. Ancient sources differ on the details. Diodorus Siculus says Ptolemy met the cortege with an army. Pausanias suggests the hijacking was arranged through bribery of the escort commander, Archimedes. What is certain is the destination changed. The body travels south, first to Memphis, the ancient pharaonic capital, where it rests for perhaps 2 decades before Ptolemy or his son transfers it to Alexandria and installs it in a purpose-built tomb near the crossroads of the city's 2 great avenues. The Soma, as it comes to be known, transforms the grid's central intersection into sacred ground. With the body comes legitimacy. Ptolemy declares himself pharaoh in 305 before the Common Era, taking the title Soter, Savior, and founding a dynasty that will rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. But he is building more than a throne. He is building a machine. The Bruchion Quarter takes shape along the northeastern waterfront. This is the royal precinct, palaces, gardens, colonnaded walkways, and administrative buildings occupying perhaps a quarter of the city's total area, according to Strabo's later account. It faces the great harbour, where the first stone wharves now handle increasing traffic. Grain barges arrive from the Nile through the canal connecting Lake Mareotis to the river's Canopic branch. Mediterranean traders dock at the eastern quays. The double harbour system, one facing the open sea, one sheltered behind the growing Heptastadion causeway, gives Alexandria a logistical advantage no other eastern Mediterranean port can match. Yet the most consequential construction is neither palace nor dock. Sometime during Ptolemy's reign, probably in its final decade, the Mouseion is established within the Bruchion Quarter. The word means shrine of the muses, but the institution is something unprecedented. A state-funded research community. Scholars receive stipends, free meals, lodging, and tax exemptions. They are not required to teach. They are required to think. Strabo describes the complex as having a covered walkway, an arcade with seats, and a large communal dining hall. Attached to it, or closely associated, is the collection that will become the Great Library. Though in these earliest years it is still modest, perhaps a few tens of thousands of scrolls. The collecting begins aggressively. Later tradition, recorded by Galen, claims that Ptolemy ordered all ships entering Alexandria's harbour to surrender any scrolls on board for copying. The originals were kept, the copies returned. Whether this policy began under the first Ptolemy or his son is debated, but the intent is clear. Alexandria is to become not merely a capital, but a repository, the place where the written knowledge of the Greek-speaking world converges. The cost of this ambition is measured in grain. Egypt's agricultural surplus, extracted through a tax system of extraordinary thoroughness, funds everything. Village by village, crop by crop, the Ptolemaic bureaucracy records yields, assesses levies, and channels wealth toward the coast. The earliest surviving administrative papyri from this period show a state that counts every aurora of land, every artaba of wheat. By the time Ptolemy dies in 283 before the Common Era, aged perhaps 84, Alexandria holds an estimated 100,000 inhabitants and is growing fast. The harbour handles hundreds of vessels. The Mouseion houses its first generation of resident scholars. Alexander's body lies in its tomb at the city's heart, drawing pilgrims and ambassadors alike. On Pharos Island, the great tower is rising. Its architect, Sostratus of Cnidus, according to Pliny and Lucian, though some scholars believe Sostratus was the patron rather than the builder, oversees the stacking of limestone and granite blocks that will soon carry a flame visible from 50 kilometers at sea. The foundation platform alone requires an engineering effort without precedent on this coastline. The lighthouse is not yet finished, but the fire that will crown it is already being planned. The fire is lit around 280 before the Common Era. Atop the tower on Pharos Island, a great curved mirror of polished bronze catches the flame and hurls it outward across the water. Sailors approaching from Cyprus, from Rhodes, from the coast of Cyrenaica, see the glow long before they see the land. Ancient sources claim the light reaches nearly 50 kilometers on a clear night. The tower itself rises in 3 diminishing stages: a square limestone base, an octagonal midsection, a circular lantern crowned by a statue, probably of Zeus Soter. Estimates of its total height range from 100 to 130 meters. Pliny calls it 800 talents in cost. Whether Sostratus of Cnidus designed it or merely dedicated it remains disputed. Lucian tells the story of Sostratus carving his own name into the stone beneath a plaster layer bearing the kings, so that time would reveal the true builder. What is certain is that the Pharos becomes the signature of the city, stamped on Alexandrian coins, copied in harbours across the Mediterranean, and remembered for 15 centuries after its completion. The king who finishes it is Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus. He inherits the throne from his father around 283 and rules until 246. Under him, the engine that will drive Alexandria for 2 centuries locks into place. That engine is grain. The Nile Valley produces a wheat surplus unmatched anywhere in the ancient world, and the Ptolemaic state controls every stage of its journey, from the fields of the Fayum to the canal barges on the Canopic branch to the warehouses at the Kiboto's inner dock, where the grain is measured, taxed, and loaded onto sea-going vessels. The revenue laws. Papyrus, dated to 259 before the Common Era, reveals the system in extraordinary detail. Tax rates on orchards, oil presses, and breweries, all calibrated to extract maximum surplus for the crown. A quarter of Egypt's agricultural output, by some estimates, flows through Alexandria's harbour. The wealth is staggering, and Philadelphus spends it deliberately. The library expands under royal mandate. Ships arriving in the harbour are searched not only for taxable cargo, but for books. Any scrolls found are copied, and the originals are sometimes kept, the copies returned to their owners. Ancient claims for the collection range from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, numbers almost certainly exaggerated, but reflecting a real ambition without parallel. Callimachus, the Cyrenaean poet and scholar, begins compiling the Pinakes, a catalogue of the library's holdings organized by genre and author, running to 120 volumes. It is, in effect, the first bibliography in Western history. The grain ships return from across the Mediterranean carrying not only silver, but scholars. Philadelphus funds the Mouseion's residents with royal stipends, free meals, lodging, tax exemptions, and access to the collection. The institution functions less like a modern library and more like a research institute with a permanent faculty. Ptolemy III, called Euergetes, who succeeds Philadelphus in 246, intensifies the book-collecting campaigns, reportedly borrowing the official Athenian copies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, forfeiting a massive deposit rather than return the originals. At the Kibotos dock, the rhythm is relentless. Hundreds of grain ships load each season, their hulls sealed with pitch, their cargo measured by royal inspectors using standardized bronze vessels. The smell of the harbour is tar, wet rope, and dry wheat dust. Customs officers record duties on papyrus. Surviving fragments show rates of 25% on some imported luxury goods. The double harbour system works flawlessly. The Great Harbour serves the royal fleet and diplomatic traffic. The Eunostos handles commercial bulk. Between them, the Heptastadion Causeway carries foot traffic, carts, and the aqueduct channels that bring Nile water into the city's underground cistern network. By 250 before the Common Era, Alexandria holds perhaps 300,000 people and is still growing. The grain feeds Rome's future appetite. The scrolls feed something harder to measure. And in the Mouseion's colonnades, a geometer named Euclid is setting down propositions that will remain uncontested for 2,000 years. Euclid does not explain where he came from. No birth city survives in the record, no father's name, no date more precise than he was active in Alexandria under the first Ptolemy. What survives is the work, 13 books of propositions, proofs, and constructions that later ages will call the elements. He composes them here, in the Mouseion's colonnades or in a private study nearby, sometime around 300 before the Common Era. The method is not invention so much as architecture. Theorems known to earlier Greek mathematicians are gathered, tested, reordered, and set upon foundations so clean that the structure will stand for over 2 millennia without a single load-bearing proof replaced. Proclus, writing 6 centuries later, preserves one anecdote. Ptolemy I asked Euclid if there was a shorter path through geometry, and Euclid replied that there is no royal road. The story may be apocryphal. The book is not. The Mouseion that shelters this work functions less like a modern university and more like a royally funded research community. Strabo will later describe it as having covered walkways, an exedra for lectures, a common dining hall, and shared revenues. Residents receive stipends from the crown, exemption from taxes, free meals. They are not required to teach. The obligation is to think, to write, to argue over dinner. The Ptolemaic treasury pays for all of it. The same grain revenues that fill the harbour warehouses fund the ink and papyrus consumed in the scriptoria a few streets away. Within this institution, around 260 before the Common Era, a Cyrenaean named Callimachus undertakes something no one has attempted at this scale: a systematic catalogue of the library's holdings. His Pinnaces, the word means tablets, eventually fills 120 volumes. It is not a simple inventory. Callimachus organizes authors by category: rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, history, medicine, mathematics, and within each category alphabetically, recording each author's birthplace, teacher, titles, opening words of each work, and line counts. It is the first known bibliographic system in history. The Pinnaces does not survive intact, but fragments quoted by later scholars reveal its precision. It transforms the library from a royal collection into a navigable institution. A generation later, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, the third head librarian, appointed around 245 before the Common Era, performs the measurement that will define Alexandrian science in popular memory. He learns that at noon on the summer solstice in Syene, far to the south, the sun stands directly overhead, casting no shadow in a deep well. In Alexandria on the same day, a vertical gnomon casts a shadow measuring roughly 1/50th of a full circle, about 7 degrees and 12 minutes. Knowing the distance between the two cities to be approximately 5,000 stadia, he calculates the Earth's full circumference at roughly 250,000 stadia. Depending on which stadion length scholars assume, this figure falls within 2 to 15% of the true value. The method is elegant, the data imperfect, the result astonishing. In the same decades, Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Ceos practice systematic human dissection, permitted in Ptolemaic Alexandria, forbidden nearly everywhere else. Herophilus distinguishes sensory from motor nerves, describes the liver, the eye, the reproductive organs, and names the duodenum. Erasistratus maps the vascular system and proposes that arteries carry pneuma rather than fluid. Wrong in conclusion, revolutionary in method. Celsus, writing later, records that they dissected condemned prisoners alive, a claim modern historians debate fiercely. What is certain is that Alexandria, for a brief window, advances anatomical knowledge further than any city will again for over 1,000 years. This is the engine at full power. Grain money buys time, time buys thought, and thought produces works that will outlast the dynasty, the empire, and the city itself. But the scholars depend entirely on royal patronage, and the dynasty that feeds them is already beginning to fracture from within. Across the Mediterranean, a republic on the Tiber is building a hunger for Egyptian wheat that no Ptolemy will be able to refuse. The city breathes at midday. Somewhere around 250 before the Common Era, Alexandria holds between 300,000 and 500,000 souls, the largest concentration of human life the Mediterranean world has ever seen. The Canopic Way stretches east to west for nearly 5 kilometers, a colonnaded boulevard wide enough for 4 wagons abreast, its limestone pavement white under the Egyptian sun. Strabo will describe it a century and a half later, but the bones of what he sees already exist. The grid laid by Deinocritus, the intersecting street of the Soma running north to south, and the 5 quarters lettered alpha through epsilon, dividing the city into a mosaic of languages, trades, and gods. Alpha and Beta belong to the Greeks, the civic heart, the agora, the law courts, the gymnasia where citizens oil their skin and argue philosophy in the afternoon shade. Delta Quarter to the northeast houses the Jewish community, organized under its own politeuma, a semi-autonomous civic body with its own courts and elders. This is one of the largest Jewish populations outside Judea, perhaps 60,000 or more, conducting business in Greek, worshipping in synagogues that face Jerusalem. In the southwest lies Rakotis, the oldest ground, the Egyptian village that predates Alexander by centuries. Here the Serapeum rises on its acropolis, a temple to Serapis, the hybrid deity Ptolemy I commissioned to bridge Greek and Egyptian worship. Its columns are visible from the harbor. The air around it carries incense and the low chanting of Egyptian priests performing rites older than the dynasty that now pays their salaries. Beneath every quarter runs water. A canal cut from the canopic branch of the Nile enters the city from the south, feeding a network of underground cisterns carved into the limestone bedrock. The El Nabi system and others like it store enough water to sustain the population through the dry months. Residents lower buckets through shafts in courtyard floors. The cisterns are engineering marvels, vaulted, pillared, cool even in summer, and they will survive longer than almost anything else the Ptolemies build. At street level, the economy is tactile. Papyrus workshops in the Egyptian quarter split and press the stalks of Cyperus papyrus into sheets that will carry Greek literature across the known world. The Ptolemies hold a royal monopoly on papyrus production, and the markup is extraordinary. Glassblowers near the harbor produce vessels in cobalt blue and amber. Alexandria will remain the Mediterranean's premier glass center for centuries. Perfume makers blend myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia into unguents sealed in alabaster jars, exported as far as the Black Sea. Linen weavers produce fabric fine enough to see through, a luxury Rome will later crave. The grain price in the markets fluctuates with the Nile flood. A good inundation means cheap bread, perhaps 1 obol for a day's ration. A poor flood, and the price doubles, and the mood in the quarters darkens. The Ptolemaic administration monitors this obsessively. The revenue laws papyrus of 259 before the Common Era documents tax rates on orchards, oil presses, and breweries with a precision that would impress a modern auditor. Every artaber of wheat is counted. Every drachma flows upward. The quarters coexist but do not always mix. Greeks dominate the citizenship roles and the gymnasium. Egyptians perform the labor and the ancient rites. Jews maintain their own legal traditions. Tensions simmer in the spaces between, a disputed market stall, a religious procession that crosses the wrong street. For now, the wealth is large enough, and the Ptolemaic administration firm enough to hold the seams together. The grid itself imposes order. Straight streets channel movement, open intersections allow surveillance. The royal Mouseion quarter commands the harbor waterfront, where the king can watch his grain fleet and his warships simultaneously. At dusk, the Pharos flame catches the last daylight, and then burns alone. From the rooftop of a Rakotis tenement, a worker can see the lighthouse, the masts in the great harbor, and the dark line of the Heptastadion causeway dividing the waters. The city hums with 100,000 cooking fires. But beyond the harbor mouth, the sea lanes that carry Alexandria's wealth are growing crowded with competitors, and the dynasty that holds this grid together is about to enter a century of fratricide. Dawn arrives first as sound. Before the sun clears the limestone ridge, the great harbour is already loud with rope and timber, with the creak of loading cranes and the shouts of stevedores in 3 languages. Hundreds of vessels ride at anchor in the eastern basin, grain transports with broad bellies, sleek Rhodian merchantmen, coastal barges from the delta, and the occasional warship of the Ptolemaic fleet, its bronze ram catching the first light. The Pharos Tower stands at the harbour mouth, like a vertical city of its own, its flames still burning pale against the brightening sky, visible to approaching captains from perhaps 50 kilometers out. Every ship that enters this harbour enters through a channel the lighthouse commands. No vessel slips past uncounted. The port infrastructure is engineered for control. The Heptastadion causeway, roughly 1,300 meters long, divides the waterfront into 2 harbours. The great harbour to the east serves the royal fleet and the high-value trade. The Eunostos, the harbour of good return, opens to the west for commercial bulk traffic. Within the Eunostos sits the Kibotos, an enclosed inner dock connected by a canal to Lake Mareotis, which itself links to the Canopic branch of the Nile. This means a cargo loaded at a village in Upper Egypt can travel by river to the lake, cross the Kibotos, and reach the open Mediterranean without once touching a road. The system is a funnel, and Alexandria sits at its narrowest point. Customs officials work the docks with papyrus registers and clay seals. Surviving papyri from the Ptolemaic administration document duties as high as 25% on certain luxury imports, a staggering rate that fills the royal treasury while the bureaucracy tracks every amphora. Outbound, the numbers are equally precise. Egypt's grain surplus, taxed from peasant farmers across the Nile Valley, flows into state warehouses along the harbour. Estimates drawn from later Roman period records suggest the annual export eventually reached roughly 150,000 tons of wheat, enough to feed a city the size of Rome for 4 months. Under the Ptolemies, this grain is leverage, diplomatic currency, famine insurance for allied cities, and the raw wealth that funds the library, the Mouseion, and the court. But grain is only half the story. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Alexandrian merchants have mastered something far more ambitious: the monsoon. Greek navigators, tradition credits a figure named Hippolus, though the dating is uncertain, learn to ride the seasonal winds directly across the Arabian Sea to India and back. The Red Sea ports of Meos, Hormos, and Berenice, connected to the Nile Valley by desert caravan roads, become Alexandria's back door to the Indian Ocean. Through them flow pepper, cinnamon, nard, pearls, Chinese silk transshipped through Indian middlemen, and East African ivory. These goods cross the desert by camel, descend the Nile or its canals, and arrive at the Kibotos dock to be repackaged, taxed again, and loaded onto westbound ships. The markup at each stage is enormous. A Roman period papyrus later records that a single shipment of Indian goods through the Red Sea corridor could be valued at 7 million sesterces. The harbour never sleeps cleanly. Silt from the Nile's branches creeps into the channels and must be dredged. Storms batter the breakwaters. Pirates haunt the approaches until Ptolemaic warships sweep them back. And the dynasty's grip on this magnificent machine is loosening. By 100 before the Common Era, Ptolemaic kings fight each other for the throne, while Rome watches with increasing interest, drawn not by Alexandria's philosophy, but by its grain. The harbour that feeds half the Mediterranean is too valuable to be left in weakening hands. Already Roman senators speak openly of Egypt as a prize. The lighthouse burns on, indifferent, guiding ships inward through the channel. Roman ships among them now, arriving more frequently, staying longer, their captains memorizing the depths. The dynasty begins to eat itself. After the victory at Raphia in 217 before the Common Era, where Ptolemy IV armed 20,000 native Egyptian soldiers and turned back the Seleucid invasion, something shifts beneath the surface of Ptolemaic power that cannot be reversed. Egyptian soldiers who fought for the crown now know their own strength. Revolts flare in Upper Egypt. A rival pharaoh rules from Thebes for nearly 2 decades. The Greek elite who built this city as their own creation must now negotiate with the land they govern, and the negotiation is written in stone. The Rosetta Stone, carved in 196 before the Common Era under the boy king Ptolemy V, records a decree in 3 scripts, hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek, because the priests of Memphis demand recognition in their own language as the price of legitimacy. The dynasty that once commanded now bargains. Alexandria itself remains staggering in its physical grandeur. The Canopic Way still runs its 5 kilometers between colonnaded facades. The Pharos still burns. Ships still crowd the great harbor. But inside the Brucheian Palace quarter, the corridors multiply with rival factions. Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII share the throne, then fight for it. The palace becomes 2 courts, then 1 again, then 2. Ministers are murdered. Queens maneuver between brothers and sons. Polybius, the Greek historian who visits Egypt in this period, describes a kingdom where the court has become a theater of conspiracy, and the native population grows restless under taxation that funds a dynasty no longer capable of defending its own borders. Rome notices. In 168 before the Common Era, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV marches on Alexandria itself. A Roman envoy named Gaius Popilius Laenus meets him in the suburb of Eleusis, draws a circle in the sand around the king with his staff, and tells him to decide before stepping out of it whether he is Rome's friend or enemy. Antiochus withdraws. The city is saved, but the lesson is unmistakable. Alexandria's survival now depends on Roman permission. The grain still flows. The harbor customs officers still stamp their seals on amphorae of wine and bales of linen. The library's scholars still copy and annotate. But the Ptolemaic kingdom has lost Cyrenaica, lost its Aegean possessions, lost Coele Syria. What remains is Egypt itself and its wheat, and everyone in the Mediterranean knows it. By the reign of Ptolemy XII, called Auletes, the flute player, the king must bribe Roman senators with 6,000 talents simply to keep his throne. When the Alexandrian mob drives him out around 58 before the Common Era, he flees to Rome and pays still more to be restored by Roman legions. The city that once projected power across the eastern Mediterranean now imports it at ruinous cost. In the streets, the consequences register as instability. Strabo will later describe a city still magnificent in its monuments, but volatile in its population. The ethnic quarters, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, press against each other with increasing friction. Palace coups ripple outward as riots. The gymnasium, once a center of civic culture, becomes a stage for political demonstrations. Yet the workshops keep producing. Alexandrian glass, papyrus, and perfume remain the finest in the known world. The grain ships still depart on schedule because Rome demands it, and the Nile still floods on time. By 51 before the Common Era, Ptolemy XII dies and leaves the throne to his 18-year-old daughter and her younger brother. Her name is Cleopatra, the seventh of that name. She inherits a city whose lighthouse still guides ships through the channel, whose library still holds more knowledge than any institution on earth, and whose independence is now a polite fiction maintained at Rome's pleasure. The engine still turns, but the hands on its controls are no longer Alexandrian. She is 18 when she takes the throne, and 21 when she loses it for the first time. Her brother's advisors drive her from the palace, and by 48 before the Common Era, Cleopatra VII is raising an army near the eastern frontier when Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, only to find Pompey already dead on the beach at Pelusium. Caesar installs himself in the royal quarter on the Lochius promontory, and within days the young queen is before him, making her case for the throne. What follows is not romance, but siege. Ptolemy XIII's forces surround the palace district. Caesar holds the harbour with a small fleet, and during the fighting he orders ships in the docks set alight to prevent their capture. The fire spreads. Plutarch writes that it destroyed the great library. Dio Cassius says warehouses of grain and books near the harbour burned. Seneca, writing earlier, mentions 400,000 scrolls lost. The sources do not agree, and modern scholars believe what burned were book warehouses awaiting export or distribution near the docks, not the library itself in the Mouseion. But the loss is real. Tens of thousands of scrolls, perhaps hundreds of thousands, turn to ash in a single night. Smoke drifts across the Canopic Way. The smell of burning papyrus hangs over the harbour for days. Caesar prevails. Ptolemy XIII drowns in the Nile Delta during the retreat. Cleopatra is restored, now co-ruling with a still younger brother. Caesar departs but leaves a garrison and, according to later sources, a child growing in the queen's womb. For the next several years, Cleopatra governs a city still magnificent, still producing glass and perfume and linen, still loading grain ships at the Kiboto's dock. She visits Rome in 46 before the Common Era, and is there when Caesar falls in 44. She returns to Alexandria and waits. The wait ends with Mark Antony. Their alliance, formalized by 37 before the Common Era, transforms the eastern Mediterranean. Antony distributes Roman-controlled territories to Cleopatra's children in the donations of Alexandria, a ceremony held in the great gymnasium. He builds a fleet in the harbour. The Ptolemaic treasury, still fed by the Nile's grain surplus, funds the war effort against Octavian. For a brief season the engine roars again, not for scholarship but for empire. It ends at Actium in 31 before the Common Era. The combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra breaks in the face of Agrippa's tactics. They flee south to Alexandria with roughly a third of their ships. The city receives them in silence. Over the following months, allies defect. The garrison wavers. Antony's forces melt away. Octavian arrives at the gates in the summer of 30 before the Common Era. There is no prolonged siege. The city opens. Within days, both Antony and Cleopatra are dead. The dynasty of Ptolemy extinguished after 275 years. Octavian, according to Suetonius, visits Alexander's tomb in the Soma and touches the preserved face of the conqueror. When asked if he wishes to see the tombs of the Ptolemies, he replies that he came to see a king, not corpses. Egypt becomes a Roman province, but not an ordinary one. It is the personal property of the emperor, governed by a prefect of equestrian rank, because no senator can be trusted with the grain supply that feeds Rome. Roughly 150,000 tons of wheat will leave Alexandria's harbor every year for the next 3 centuries. The engine still turns, but its purpose has changed entirely. The grain no longer funds a library or a lighthouse keeper's salary or a scholar's stipend at the Mouseion. It feeds Rome. The Pharos still burns above the channel, guiding ships that carry wealth outward and return with orders. The Canopic Way still runs its 5 kilometers east to west, still colonnaded, still crowded. But the palace on Lochias now houses a Roman prefect, and the decisions that shape the city are made on the Palatine Hill, 1,500 kilometers away. Strabo arrives in the city around 25 years before the Common Era, traveling with the prefect Aelius Gallus, and what he records is the most complete portrait any ancient writer leaves of Alexandria. He walks the Canopic Way and counts the colonnades on both sides, notes the gymnasia and the law courts, climbs the Paneion, a small artificial hill with a spiral path offering a view across the entire grid, and describes the royal quarter, the Mouseion, as occupying perhaps a quarter or a third of the city's total area. His geography, Book 17, remains the single most important source for understanding what the city looked like under its new masters. The new masters are careful. Augustus does not destroy the Ptolemaic infrastructure. He inherits it. The grain warehouses at the Kibotos dock, the customs apparatus, the canal linking Lake Mareotis to the Canopic branch of the Nile, all of it continues to function, now redirected. The annual grain fleet, perhaps 200 ships in the largest convoys, departs each spring for Puteoli and later Ostia, carrying roughly 150,000 tons of wheat that feeds the Roman populace. Josephus records that Egypt supplies 1/3 of Rome's grain. The prefect who oversees this operation answers directly to the emperor. No senator may enter the province without imperial permission. Egypt is not a province in the ordinary sense. It is a personal estate. Augustus himself visits the city in 30 before the Common Era, shortly after Cleopatra's death. Suetonius and Dio Cassius both record that he goes to the Soma and gazes upon Alexander's body in its glass or crystal sarcophagus. When asked if he wishes to see the tombs of the Ptolemies, he reportedly declines. He came to see a king, he says, not corpses. The anecdote, whatever its accuracy, captures Rome's relationship with the city. Reverence for its founder, indifference to its dynasty. The population under Roman rule reaches perhaps 500,000, including the suburbs and the communities along the canal. The citizenship hierarchy is rigid and consequential. Roman citizens pay the lowest taxes. Alexandrian citizens, those enrolled in the Greek civic body, pay reduced rates. Egyptians pay the full poll tax, the laographia, a burden that makes legal status a matter of daily economic survival. The Jewish community, concentrated in the Delta Quarter in the northeastern part of the city, occupies an ambiguous position. They possess their own politeuma, a semi-autonomous communal government, but their exact civic rights remain contested. That contestation turns lethal in 38 of the Common Era. The prefect Aulus Avilius Flaccus, politically vulnerable in Rome, permits or encourages a pogrom against the Jewish quarter. Philo of Alexandria, an eyewitness, describes synagogues desecrated, homes looted, residents driven into a narrow district. Thousands perish. Philo travels to Rome to petition the Emperor Caligula, and his account, against Flaccus and the embassy to Gaius, preserves the earliest detailed record of ethnic mass violence in a Mediterranean city. The tensions do not end. In 66 of the Common Era, the prefect Tiberius Julius Alexander, himself of Jewish origin, suppresses another uprising in the Jewish quarter. Josephus records the casualties in the thousands, yet the city's physical fabric continues to grow. The Caesareum, begun by Cleopatra for Antony and completed by Augustus, stands on the waterfront with two great obelisks before its entrance. The granite needles quarried at Aswan a millennium and a half earlier, which will eventually travel to London and New York in the 19th century. Public baths multiply. The Hadrianic period brings new construction. The grain ships still load at the docks each spring, and the Pharos still burns above the harbour mouth, its mirror reflecting firelight across 50 kilometres of open sea. Pliny the Elder records its cost at 800 talents. The engine runs steadily, even magnificently. But it runs for Rome now. The Mouseion still exists, scholars still receive stipends, still dine together in the communal hall, but the great age of original discovery has passed. The institution produces commentators, editors, and compilers rather than Euclids and Eratosthenes. The library's holdings are maintained but no longer grow with the aggressive acquisition campaigns of the early Ptolemies. Knowledge is preserved, copied, transmitted. It is no longer the city's purpose. The purpose is grain. And somewhere beneath the streets, the cisterns still fill with Nile water carried by the canal, and the underground channels still distribute it to fountains across the grid. The infrastructure holds. The walls hold. The harbour holds. But the light on the Pharos now guides ships carrying wealth to a capital that is not Alexandria. The wealth flows to Rome now, but the city still wakes before the sun does. Around the year 100 of the Common Era, under the reign of Trajan, a morning in Alexandria begins in the harbour district, with the sound of water slapping against stone quays and the groan of mooring ropes tightening as the tide shifts. The grain fleet will not sail until late summer. The Annona ships wait for the Etesian winds, but the harbour never empties. Smaller vessels from Cyprus, Syria, and Crete crowd the great harbour's eastern wharves, unloading amphorae of wine, timber, and salted fish. Customs officials stamp clay seals and scratch tallies onto papyrus sheets. The tariff on most imports remains at 25%, a rate inherited from the Ptolemies and maintained by Rome because it works. Inland, the Canopic Way catches the first light. The colonnaded boulevard stretches nearly 5 kilometres east to west, wide enough for 2 carts to pass between the column rows. At this hour the bread sellers are already at their stalls. Oxyrhynchus papyri, the closest documented proxy for Alexandrian prices, record a loaf costing roughly 1 obol, perhaps 2, for finer wheat bread. A labourer in the harbour earns between 4 and 6 obols a day. Bread is affordable but never cheap. The grain that feeds the city is the same grain that feeds Rome, and the prefect controls its distribution with careful attention. South of the great boulevard, in the old Rakotis quarter, the glass-blowers' workshops are firing their furnaces. Alexandria's glassmakers are famous across the empire. They produce millefiori bowls, translucent drinking vessels, and small perfume flasks in cobalt blue and amber that travel as far as the Rhine frontier. The raw materials, soda from the Wadi Natrun, sand from the coast, arrive cheaply. The skill is local, passed through generations of Egyptian and Syrian craftsmen working side by side. The heat from the furnaces is intense enough to keep the narrow streets warm even in the cool mornings of the Alexandrian winter, which rarely drops below 10 degrees but feels sharp against the sea wind. By mid-morning, the public baths are full. Alexandria has at least several large bath complexes by this period, modelled on Roman thermae but adapted to the local climate. Less emphasis on the heated caldarium, more on the cold plunge pools fed by the underground cistern network. The water still arrives through the canal connecting the city to the Canopic branch of the Nile, filling hundreds of cisterns beneath the streets. Some of these cisterns, excavated in the modern era, reveal columns and vaulted ceilings, underground cathedrals of brick and stone holding the city's most essential resource. A modest household meal around midday consists of lentil soup, flatbread, dried fish, onions, and beer or diluted wine. Athenaeus, writing somewhat later but drawing on earlier Alexandrian sources, describes a city obsessed with food, its cooks, its sauces, its varieties of fish from Lake Mareotis. The lake still produces tilapia and mullet in abundance. Wealthier homes have mosaic floors depicting Nilotic scenes, crocodiles, lotus flowers, fishing boats, fragments of which survive in museum collections today. The gymnasium, that great civic institution of the Greek citizen class, occupies its afternoon hours with exercise, lectures, and the social negotiations that define status in a city where citizenship is layered into strict hierarchies. Roman citizens at the top, Alexandrian Greeks below, Egyptians paying a higher poll tax, the laiographia, that marks their lesser legal standing. The building itself, described by Strabo a century earlier, features porticos over a stadion in length. As the afternoon light turns amber and the shadows of the columns stretch across the Canopic Way, the city shifts toward evening. Oil lamps, small clay vessels with a single wick, thousands of which survive in archaeological collections, begin to appear in doorways and shop fronts. The scent of burning olive oil mixes with incense from the remaining temple precincts and the ever-present salt air from the harbour. And then, as the sun drops behind the Eunostos harbour and the western sky flares copper and rose, the Pharos Lighthouse takes its turn. The fire at its summit, fed by wood or possibly dried dung, reflected by polished bronze mirrors, catches and holds, visible for perhaps 50 kilometers out to sea. Every ship approaching the Egyptian coast steers by it. Every fisherman on Lake Mareotis sees its glow reflected in the water. The city that sends its grain to feed another capital still burns its own flame, still guides the world's ships home. But that flame now illuminates a city whose soul is splitting. By the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, Alexandria holds perhaps 400,000 people, and among them a new faith is taking root in the narrow streets behind the colonnaded boulevards, in modest houses where bread is broken and hymns are sung in Greek with an Egyptian accent. The catechetical school emerges as Christianity's first great intellectual engine. Tradition places its origins in the late 2nd century under Pantaenus, a converted Stoic philosopher who reportedly travelled as far as India. By the 190s, Clement of Alexandria leads it, a man steeped in Greek philosophy who argues that Plato and the prophets drank from the same divine spring. His student Origen, born around 185, will become the most prolific Christian writer of antiquity, producing by some ancient estimates 6,000 works, dictating to teams of scribes funded by a wealthy patron named Ambrose. The same city that perfected the cataloguing of pagan knowledge now begins cataloguing scripture. Yet the Serapeum still towers over Rakotis. Its red granite column, nearly 27 meters tall, the largest monolithic column in Egypt, anchors a temple complex that remains the beating heart of traditional worship. Pilgrims still climb the 100 steps to consult the oracle. The Apis bull is still honored. Inside the precinct, a subsidiary collection of scrolls serves scholars who have no interest in the new faith. Two Alexandrias now coexist on the same grid of streets, praying to different powers, reading different texts, sharing the same bread and the same harbor. The Roman state notices. Under the Emperor Decius, in 250, an empire-wide edict demands that every citizen sacrifice to the traditional gods and obtain a certificate proving compliance. Papyri from the Egyptian countryside preserve these certificates, small bureaucratic documents that carry the weight of life and refusal. Eusebius of Caesarea records that the bishop of Alexandria, Dionysius, fled the city during the persecution, while many of the faithful did not. The Decian persecution is brief. Decius dies within 2 years, but it reveals the fracture lines running beneath the city's surface. Worse follows. In 297, Alexandria revolts against the emperor Diocletian, supporting the usurper Lucius Domitius Domitianus. Diocletian arrives personally and lays siege to the city. The walls that once welcomed the world's merchant fleets now seal the population inside. The siege lasts approximately 8 months. When the city falls, Diocletian reportedly orders destruction until his horse stumbles and he halts the devastation, a story preserved by later sources, possibly embellished. But the damage is real. Entire districts are leveled. The population, already declining from 3rd century plagues and economic disruption, drops further. The great column that later centuries will wrongly call Pompey's Pillar is erected around this time, probably to honor Diocletian himself, a victory monument planted in the courtyard of the Serapeum, commemorating the emperor who broke the city's resistance. Then comes the great persecution of 303. Diocletian's edicts target Christians specifically. Churches demolished, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned. The Coptic Church will later begin its calendar from this year, the era of martyrs. So deep is the wound in communal memory. Eusebius describes Alexandrian Christians enduring imprisonment and forced labor in the mines of Phano. The persecution ends with the Edict of Milan in 313, when Constantine and Licinius grant toleration throughout the empire. Christianity steps from the side streets onto the Canopic Way. But toleration is not peace. The theological disputes that will consume the 4th century are already germinating. Arius, an Alexandrian presbyter, is formulating the doctrine that will split Christendom at Nicaea in 325. The Serapeum still stands on its hill, its oracle still consulted, its column catching the afternoon light. The grain ships still sail for Rome and now for Constantinople. The Pharos still burns. But the city that once unified knowledge under one roof now houses 2 irreconcilable visions of the divine, and the emperor who has just ended the persecution is building a new capital on the Bosphorus, a city that will soon claim Alexandria's primacy, its grain, and its scholars. The two irreconcilable visions do not coexist for long. Within a decade of Constantine's edict, Alexandria becomes the crucible where Christian orthodoxy is forged through conflict. Athanasius, elected bishop in 328, is exiled 5 times by 4 different emperors over 45 years, driven out by Arian rivals, restored by Orthodox allies, hidden among the monks of the Egyptian desert, returned each time to a city that has become the theological battleground of the empire. The canopic way that once echoed with philosophical debate now rings with doctrinal fury. Socrates Scholasticus records street clashes between factions, churches seized and re-seized, congregations locked out of their own doors. Yet through these decades the old city persists in layers. The Serapeum still crowns its hill in Rakotis, its courtyard stretching nearly 100 meters on each side, its interior dim with incense, its subsidiary library, a daughter collection of the original, still housing thousands of scrolls on shelved wooden cases. Rufinus, who sees it before the end, describes columns of extraordinary height, marble revetments, and a colossal cult statue of Serapis fashioned from precious materials, its outstretched hand engineered so that a beam of sunlight strikes it on a precise morning each year. Pilgrims still climb the steps, the oracle still speaks, and in the Mouseion's diminished halls, Theon of Alexandria works quietly. He is editing Euclid's elements into the recension that will survive into the medieval world, the version Arab translators will carry to Baghdad, the version that will reach Europe and shape mathematics for 15 centuries. His daughter Hypatia studies beside him, learning astronomy, geometry, and Neoplatonic philosophy. She will become the last great public intellectual of ancient Alexandria, lecturing to students from across the eastern Mediterranean, consulted by the Roman prefect Orestes himself. The breaking point arrives in 391. Emperor Theodosius issues a decree prohibiting pagan sacrifice and ordering temples closed throughout the empire. In Alexandria, Bishop Theophilus seizes the moment. After skirmishes between pagans and Christians near a converted Mithraeum escalate into open violence, Theophilus receives imperial authorization to destroy the Serapeum. Socrates Scholasticus and Rufinus both describe what follows. The Christian crowd ascends the hill. The great statue is dismembered and its pieces dragged through the streets. The temple is systematically demolished. The subsidiary library's fate goes unrecorded in detail. The silence itself is telling. A church of St. John rises on the platform where Serapis once sat. Only the massive red granite column the later world will misname Pompey's Pillar remains standing, a Diocletian-era monument that predates the destruction by a century. The cost of this victory reveals itself slowly. The pagan intellectual tradition does not vanish overnight. Hypatia continues teaching into the early 5th century, her lectures on Diophantus and Apollonius drawing Christian and pagan students alike. But the space for independent thought narrows. In 415, during a bitter political struggle between Bishop Cyril and the prefect Orestes, a mob of Parabolani Orsti church auxiliaries seizes Hypatia and kills her. The accounts of Socrates of Constantinople and the later philosopher Damasius differ in detail, but agree on the essential fact. No one is meaningfully punished. The Pharos still burns above the harbor. The grain ships still sail, now feeding Constantinople as much as Rome. Perhaps 300,000 people still crowd the quarters. Churches multiply. The Caesareum, where Cleopatra's obelisks once flanked a royal temple, is now the great church. Mosaic floors depicting Christ replace floors depicting Dionysus. But something has closed. The city that once housed every idea the Mediterranean could produce has chosen one truth and silenced the others. Theon's edition of Euclid will outlast every church built on every destroyed temple, carrying Alexandrian light forward through channels the city itself can no longer control. In the workshops of Rakotis, glass blowers still shape vessels by techniques unchanged for centuries, and the underground cisterns still deliver Nile water to neighborhood fountains. The city endures, but the ground beneath it has begun, quite literally, to shift. The earthquakes that will swallow the royal quarter and crack the Pharos are already sending tremors through the harbor floor. The tremors that Ammianus Marcellinus recorded on the 21st of July, 365 of the Common Era, had already rewritten the waterfront before Hypatia ever walked the Canopic Way. A submarine earthquake off southwestern Crete sent a wall of water across the eastern Mediterranean. Ships were hurled inland. The harbor floor heaved, then sank. Ammianus, writing from Antioch, described vessels deposited on rooftops and stranded fish flopping on exposed seabed before the wave returned. In Alexandria, the royal quarter along the Lochias promontory, already weakened by centuries of subsidence, dropped further beneath the waterline. Frank Godio's underwater surveys, conducted with differential GPS precision, have mapped the results. Palace foundations, column drums, and carved granite blocks now resting 3 to 6 meters below the modern harbor surface, their displacement consistent with catastrophic tectonic settling, compounded by gradual land subsidence across the river delta. After 415, the damage compounds. Further seismic events through the 5th and 6th centuries, less dramatically documented but recorded in Coptic and Byzantine chronicles, crack the Pharos. The lighthouse loses its upper octagonal and cylindrical tiers. What remains is the massive square base, still functional as a beacon platform, but the mirror apparatus that once projected firelight 50 kilometers to sea is gone. Arab geographers arriving centuries later will describe a truncated tower, impressive but visibly broken. The structure that once announced Alexandria's supremacy to every approaching vessel now confesses its diminishment. The harbor silts. The Canopic branch of the Nile, which once fed fresh water through the city's canal and flushed the port basin, narrows as upstream irrigation channels divert its flow. Without the river's current to scour the harbor floor, sediment accumulates. The great anchorage that once held hundreds of grain ships grows shallow. Trade routes pivot toward Constantinople, which now commands the Bosporus and the empire's administrative gravity. Alexandria's annual grain shipment, once the lifeline connecting Egypt to Rome, is redirected to the new capital on the Golden Horn. The engine that built the city now feeds another. The Brucheion quarter empties. Where Ptolemaic kings once held court and Strabo marveled at continuous colonnades, weeds push through cracked marble pavements. Salvagers strip bronze fittings and lead pipe. The population contracts from perhaps 500,000 at its Roman peak to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. Still a major city by late antique standards, but a city withdrawing into itself, occupying a shrinking footprint within walls built for a larger organism. Yet Alexandria does not die. It transforms. The Coptic Patriarchate, seated here since the tradition of St. Mark, becomes one of the most powerful ecclesiastical offices in Christendom. Monasteries and churches absorb the shells of temples. The theological school that once produced Origen now produces Cyril and his successors, whose doctrinal battles over the nature of Christ reshape the entire Christian world. After the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the Egyptian church splits from Constantinople's orthodoxy, and Alexandria becomes the capital of a distinct Coptic communion, defiant, intellectually vigorous, rooted in the Egyptian countryside in ways the old Greek elite never were. And in a modest study somewhere in this contracting city, around 500 of the Common Era, John Philoponus picks up his pen. A Christian grammarian trained in the Aristotelian tradition, he produces commentaries that challenge Aristotle's physics directly, arguing that a thrown object carries an internal impetus rather than being pushed by the surrounding air. The insight will travel through Syriac and Arabic translations to reach medieval Paris, where it will seed the concepts that eventually become inertia. Philoponus is the last great mind the Mouseion's intellectual tradition produces, working in a city whose colonnades are half empty, whose lighthouse is broken, whose harbour is silting shut. The light has not gone out. It has simply grown quieter, concentrated in fewer rooms, carried by fewer hands, waiting for the knock at the gate that will come within a single generation. That knock comes sooner than anyone expects. In 619 of the Common Era, a Sasanian Persian army sweeps through the Nile Delta and takes Alexandria almost without resistance. The Byzantine garrison, weakened by decades of theological civil war between Chalcedonian and Monophysite Christians, cannot hold the walls. For 10 years the city passes under Persian control, a humiliation that severs it from Constantinople and disrupts the grain shipments that still trickle westward. The Persians do not destroy the city, but they strip its remaining wealth. Churches lose their silver liturgical vessels. The Patriarchate, already fractured, scatters. Emperor Heraclius recovers Egypt in 629 after his stunning campaigns against Persia, but the restoration is brittle. He appoints Cyrus as both patriarch and prefect, a dual authority meant to impose Chalcedonian orthodoxy on a population overwhelmingly Coptic. The result is persecution. John of Nikiu's chronicle, written within a generation of these events, records forced conversions, imprisonment of Coptic clergy, and a population that comes to regard Byzantine rule as occupation. When the next conqueror arrives, many Egyptians feel little loyalty to the empire that claims to protect them. Amr ibn al-As crosses into Egypt in late 639 with perhaps 4,000 cavalry, later reinforced to between 10 and 15,000. He takes Pelusium, then the fortress of Babylon near modern Cairo, and turns north toward Alexandria. The city he approaches still holds roughly 200,000 inhabitants behind walls that stretch for 15 kilometers, but those walls enclose vast empty quarters. The Mouseion is rubble, the Pharos stands truncated, its upper tiers collapsed. The great harbour has silted so badly that only shallow draft vessels can navigate its inner basin. The Heptastadion causeway has accumulated so much sediment on either side that it is becoming a permanent land bridge, slowly erasing the double harbour that once made the city supreme. The siege begins in 641 and lasts approximately 14 months. John of Nikiu describes skirmishes outside the walls, sorties by the Byzantine garrison, and negotiations that drag through seasons. The city's cisterns still hold water. Centuries of underground engineering ensure that, but supplies dwindle and no relief fleet arrives from Constantinople. The Byzantine court, exhausted by Persian wars and internal revolt, cannot project force this far south. In September of 642, a treaty is reached. The garrison is given 11 months to evacuate by sea. The terms are notably restrained: no general sack, no mass enslavement. The gates open. Arab soldiers enter a city of colonnaded avenues half overgrown, of churches built from temple stones, of a lighthouse whose fire has not burned in living memory. The famous story that Caliph Omar ordered the library's books burned as fuel for the city's bathhouses, declaring that books agreeing with the Quran were redundant and those disagreeing were dangerous, appears nowhere in any source for nearly 6 centuries. It surfaces first in the accounts of Ibn al-Kifti and Bar Hebraeus in the 13th century, long after any institutional library had ceased to function. The Mouseion's scholarly community had dissolved centuries before. The daughter libraries had been dispersed, destroyed, or absorbed piecemeal across generations of riot, siege, and neglect. What Amr ibn al-As finds is not a city of books, but a city of churches, empty colonnades, and silted docks. He does not stay. The new capital rises at Fustat, inland on the Nile, where the river commands Egypt's agriculture directly. Alexandria, for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, is no longer a capital of anything. The engine that Alexander identified, the junction of harbor and river, of Mediterranean trade and Nile grain, has been bypassed. The grain still grows, but it flows through a different city now. The harbor that once loaded 300 ships in a season receives fewer each year. The Canopic Way, where Strabo counted colonnades and Achilles, Tatius marveled at the crowds, grows quiet. Dust settles on limestone thresholds. The muezzin's call rises over a skyline of crosses and broken pediments, and the ancient city begins its long descent into the ground and the sea, where it will wait for the archaeologists who will not come for another 12 centuries. 12 centuries is a long time to forget a city. But Alexandria does not vanish in a single season. It empties slowly, like a cistern whose inlet has been sealed. The water still gleams at the bottom, but the level drops year by year, decade by decade, until the stone walls stand dry and the echo changes. Amr ibn al-As founds Fustat near the apex of the Nile Delta in 642, and Egypt's center of gravity shifts 60 leagues south. The grain tax, the administrative correspondence, the garrison payrolls, all of it flows through the new capital now. Alexandria retains its patriarch, its harbor, its reputation, but not its purpose. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad caliphs regard it primarily as a naval station, useful for launching raids against Byzantine Cyprus and Sicily. The dockyards still function, the walls still stand. But the Canopic Way, 5 kilometers of colonnaded boulevard, has begun to crumble at its edges. Columns topple and are not replaced. Sand drifts into doorways that no one opens. The Arab geographer al-Mas'udi, writing around 940, describes a city of marvels and ruins intermingled. The great pillar the locals call the Pillar of Pompey still rises above the Rakotis hill, and the underground cisterns still hold water, fed by a canal from the Nile that requires constant maintenance. He notes the lighthouse, still partially standing. its upper stories damaged by earthquakes, but its base immense beyond anything he has seen elsewhere. Al-Idrisi, composing his geography for the Norman king Roger of Sicily around 1154, records the Pharos as functional but diminished, its mirror or fire visible only a fraction of the distance ancient sources claimed. Then the earthquakes finish what time began. A severe tremor in 1103 damages the lighthouse further. Another in 1261 collapses the upper two tiers entirely. By 1326, when the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta arrives, he finds the structure so ruined that he cannot even reach the doorway. He describes Alexandria itself as a city whose ancient walls enclose vast empty spaces, gardens, rubble fields, cemeteries where neighborhoods once stood. The population has perhaps fallen below 50,000. The Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay arrives at the Pharos site in 1477 and orders a fortress built on the lighthouse's massive foundation platform, incorporating its fallen granite blocks into the new walls. The citadel that rises is handsome and functional, a military installation where a wonder of the world once stood. Fishermen mend nets in the shadow of stones that Sostratus, or whoever truly designed the Pharos, had placed 1,200 years before. By the Ottoman conquest in 1517, Alexandria has contracted to a walled town of perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 souls, huddled around the Turkish harbour on what was once the Heptastadion, now silted into a permanent isthmus. The ancient double harbour is gone, the great harbour shallow and choked, the Eunostos partially filled. Beneath the streets, the vast Ptolemaic cistern network still exists, its pillared chambers stretching in darkness, holding rainwater for a population that is a 50th of what it once was. The obelisks still stand, the pair that Augustus had moved from Heliopolis to the Caesareum. They will not remain much longer. The British remove one to London's Thames embankment in 1877. The Americans take the other to New York's Central Park in 1881. The Caesareum itself has been gone for centuries. When Napoleon's army arrives in 1798, his corps of scholars, the savants of the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, find a fishing town of roughly 6,000 inhabitants inside walls that could hold 500,000. They sketch Pompey's pillar, measure the cisterns, note the Qaitbay fortress, and record everything in the monumental Description de l'Égypte. They are standing on top of the ancient city without knowing it. The royal quarter lies beneath the harbour water. The library's site lies beneath Ottoman houses. The Soma, Alexander's tomb, lies somewhere below. No one knows where. The scholars draw what they can see, and what they cannot see waits in the salt water and the sand, patient as limestone, for the divers and the excavators who will come 2 centuries later with sonar and cameras and the slow, careful hands that the buried city deserves. Those slow, careful hands arrive first not underwater, but on paper. In 1866, a Danish-born Egyptian astronomer named Mahmoud Bey el-Falaki does something no one has attempted in the city's modern life. He walks the streets of Ottoman Alexandria with surveying instruments, sinks trial trenches at dozens of points, and maps what he finds beneath the surface: buried column bases, foundation walls, paving stones still aligned on their original axes. When he publishes his plan, the ancient grid emerges like a palimpsest, the canopic way's east-west line, the street of the Soma running north-south, the intersecting avenues that Strabo described 18 centuries earlier. The city is not lost, it is merely underneath. A century passes before excavation catches up with the map. In 1960, Polish archaeologists begin work at Kom Eldika, a mound in the city centre slated for modern construction. What they uncover over the following decades astonishes. A small Roman-era amphitheatre with 13 tiers of white marble seating, the only structure of its kind found in Egypt, and beside it a complex of at least 20 small lecture halls with tiered stone benches, possibly the remains of a late academic quarter, perhaps even a successor to the ancient Mouseion. Mosaic floors, bird mosaics in fine tesserae, and a Roman-era bathing complex emerge from the rubble of centuries. The dig proves that intellectual life persisted here well into the 6th century of the Common Era, long after the library's scrolls had scattered. But the most dramatic recovery happens beneath the harbour water. In 1996, the French underwater archaeologist Franck Goddio begins systematic sonar and GPS surveys of the eastern harbour floor. What the instruments reveal is staggering in scale. The entire Royal Mouseion quarter, palaces, quays, colonnades, the small island of Antirrhodos, where Cleopatra's private palace once stood, lies scattered across the seabed at depths of 6 to 8 meters, toppled by the earthquakes and subsidence that centuries of tremors inflicted on the coastline. Goddio's team maps over 11,000 square meters of submerged structures. Divers glide over fallen granite columns, colossal statues of Ptolemaic rulers, sphinxes carved from dark stone, ceramic vessels still resting where they settled. A headless statue identified as a Ptolemaic queen stands upright on the harbour floor as if still guarding a threshold. Simultaneously, Jean-Yves Empereur works at the Pharos site beneath the Kate Bay fortress. His team catalogues over 3,000 architectural blocks, granite columns weighing up to 75 tons, door jambs, statue fragments, tumbled from the lighthouse and from temples that once stood on Pharos Island. Among them are pieces of colossal statues, likely the figures that Arab travellers described flanking the lighthouse entrance before the final collapse. Each artifact surfaces into museum light, carrying the weight of a specific century. Coins of Ptolemy II, amphora handles stamped with customs marks, inscribed blocks naming officials whose papyrus records survive in Cairo's collections. The objects confirm what the texts always claimed, that the royal quarter was magnificent, that the harbour was engineered with precision, that the city's wealth was tangible and immense. Yet the deepest challenge remains. Modern Alexandria, a city of more than 5 million people, sits directly atop the ancient one. Every foundation dug for an apartment block, every sewer trench, every parking garage potentially cuts through Ptolemaic or Roman strata. Salvage archaeology races against construction. Most of the ancient city will never be excavated. It lives beneath homes, schools, and roads, accessible only in fragments when the modern city briefly opens its skin. In 2002, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina opens on the Corniche, near the ancient library's probable location. Its tilted granite disc of a roof faces the same harbour where the grain fleet once gathered. Inside, shelving for 8 million volumes waits to be filled. It is not a reconstruction. No one knows what the original library looked like, but a conscious echo, an act of memory built in concrete and glass on the same strip of limestone where Alexander once stood. the harbour water still holds more than has been raised. Gaudio estimates that years of further survey remain. Beneath the waves, columns lie in the silt at angles that record the precise direction of their fall, and somewhere below the modern streets, in a location no instrument has yet confirmed, the Soma, the tomb that Caesar visited, that Augustus touched, that Caracalla entered, waits in the dark, patient as the city itself. Patient as the city itself, and far more travelled than its founders ever imagined. The knowledge that left Alexandria did not travel as a single flame, but as 1,000 scattered sparks, each carried forward by hands that often had no idea where the light originated. Consider the journey of a single book. Euclid composed his Elements in Alexandria around 300 before the Common Era. The text passed through generations of Alexandrian copyists, was edited definitively by Theon in the 4th century, carried to Constantinople by Byzantine scholars, translated into Arabic in Baghdad by al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf around 800 of the Common Era, refined by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi in 13th century Persia, rendered into Latin by Adelard of Bath in 12th century England from an Arabic manuscript he found in Spain, and finally printed in Venice in 1482, the first mathematical bestseller of the age of print. Every geometry classroom on Earth descends from that chain, and the chain begins in a colonnade beside the harbour of Alexandria. The same transmission carried Ptolemy's Almagest, the astronomical system that governed the sky for 14 centuries, through Arabic translators in Baghdad, who called it by its Arabic-Greek hybrid name, then into Latin Europe, where it shaped Copernicus, who dismantled it. Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth survived in fragments quoted by later authors. The Septuagint, translated in Alexandria for the city's Greek-speaking Jewish community, became the scripture of early Christianity and the textual foundation of the New Testament's quotations from Hebrew tradition. What did not survive has become equally powerful. The myth of the lost library, a single catastrophic burning, all of human knowledge destroyed in one night, is largely an invention of later centuries. No ancient source describes such an event. The real dissolution was gradual. Reduced royal funding after the Roman annexation, the slow dispersal of scholars, the fragmentation of collections across rival institutions, the shift of patronage to Constantinople. But the myth endures because it answers a deep human fear that knowledge, once gathered, can be lost forever. Every modern archive, every digital backup protocol, every open-access journal carries within it an anxiety that Alexandria first named. The Pharos Lighthouse, too, outlived its stones. Arab geographers described it with precision for centuries after its upper tiers had crumbled. Its image appears on Roman coins minted in Alexandria in medieval manuscripts, and today on the coat of arms of the modern Egyptian governorate of Alexandria, a beacon still burning in heraldry long after the last fire went cold above the harbour. The very concept of the lighthouse as a symbol of guidance traces back to that single tower on Pharos Island. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, inaugurated in 2002 on the Corniche near the ancient library's probable site, holds the paradox openly. It is not a resurrection. No one knows the original building's plan, its shelving, its reading arrangements. It is instead a declaration that the idea of gathering the world's knowledge in one place beside this particular harbour still exerts a gravitational pull 23 centuries after Ptolemy I conceived it. Its circular reading room seats 2,000. Its shelves have capacity for 8 million volumes. Outside its walls, 5 million people inhabit a modern city built directly atop the ancient one, walking daily over cisterns, column drums, and mosaic floors they will never see. The real Alexandria and the legendary one have become inseparable, each feeding the other. The real city was louder, dirtier, more violent, more extraordinary than the legend admits. It ran on taxed grain and coerced labor as much as on genius. Its scholars ate meals paid for by the surplus of Egyptian farmers who never entered the Mouseion's gates. Its harbors loaded wheat for foreign mouths. Its light was brilliant and its shadow was deep, and both belonged to the same engine. At sunset, the Mediterranean off the modern Corniche turns the same amber it turned when the Pharos flame caught the last daylight and threw it seaward. The ridge between two waters remains. The harbor remains. Somewhere beneath the surface, stones remember the weight of the world's first great library, and the water keeps its secrets with the patience of 23 centuries. Thank you for joining this journey through every century of Alexandria's extraordinary life. If these streets and stories have stayed with you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next city whose stones still have something to say.